The raging waters of the Rio Grande roared with unbridled fury as Lillian Hayes clung desperately to her younger sister's hand, both of them gasping for air as the merciless current pulled them deeper into its deadly embrace. "Hold on, Sophia!" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the thunderous rush of the flooded river that had, only moments before, swept them from the riverbank where they'd been gathering water for their homestead. It was the spring of 1875 in Terlingua, Texas, and the seasonal rains had transformed the normally manageable Rio Grande into a monstrous force of nature. Lillian, 22 and the more practical of the Hayes sisters, had warned 19-year-old Sophia about getting too close to the edge. But Sophia, with her endless curiosity and impulsive nature, had leaned too far over to watch a family of turtles, losing her balance on the slippery mud. When Lillian lunged to catch her, both sisters were pulled into the swollen river. "I can't," Sophia spluttered, water filling her mouth as another wave crashed over them. Her golden hair, usually so meticulously pinned, now plastered across her face like seaweed. "You can. Just keep kicking," Lillian commanded, though her own strength was failing rapidly. The weight of her sodden skirts dragged her downward, and she could feel her grip on her sister's hand weakening. The murky waters of the Rio Grande had claimed many lives over the years, and Lillian was terrified they would be the next victims. A half-mile upstream, Yates Sutherland was guiding his horse along the riverbank, returning to his small cattle ranch after delivering a message to the sheriff in town. At 30, Yates had seen his share of danger in the untamed West, but nothing had prepared him for the sight that greeted him as he rounded the bend: two women fighting for their lives in the churning rapids. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, then dismounted at a gallop, tearing off his heavy leather vest and gun belt. "Hold on," he bellowed, though he wasn't sure if they could hear him over the river's roar. He dove into the freezing water, powerful strokes propelling him toward the desperate pair. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, threatening to slam him against the partially submerged boulders that dotted the river. Years of breaking wild horses and wrestling steers had built Yates' strength, but the river was a different kind of adversary, one that never tired. Lillian saw him approaching, a blur of motion cutting through the water with determined precision. Hope flared within her chest, even as her fingers began to slip from Sophia's grasp. "Someone's coming," she gasped, her voice raw from swallowed river water. Sophia's panicked eyes found the approaching figure. "I can't hold on." "Yes, you can." Lillian tightened her grip, ignoring the burning in her lungs and the numbness creeping into her limbs. Yates reached them just as Sophia's hand slipped from Lillian's grasp. With lightning reflexes, he lunged forward, catching the younger woman before the current could claim her. "I've got you," he shouted, his arm encircling her waist as he fought to keep them both afloat. Lillian had been swept several yards downstream, her strength finally failing as she slipped beneath the surface. Yates' heart pounded with fear as he quickly assessed his impossible situation: two drowning women and only one of him. With a powerful kick, he managed to propel himself and Sophia toward a low-hanging tree branch extending over the water. "Grab it and hold on," he commanded, practically throwing the gasping woman upward. Sophia's fingers clutched the branch with desperate strength as Yates immediately turned and dove back into the current, swimming with powerful strokes toward where Lillian had disappeared. The murky water revealed nothing. Panic surged through him as he dove beneath the surface, eyes stinging as he searched the swirling depths. On his third dive, his hand brushed against fabric, and he seized it, pulling upward with all his might. Lillian's unconscious form broke the surface, her face pale and lips tinged with blue. With one arm around her chest, Yates battled the current, every muscle screaming in protest as he fought his way toward the bank. Behind him, Sophia had managed to pull herself along the branch until she reached the trunk of the tree, where she clung, sobbing and watching the desperate rescue attempt. When Yates finally dragged Lillian onto the muddy shore, she wasn't breathing. With practiced movements born from past emergencies, he turned her onto her stomach and pressed firmly on her back, forcing the water from her lungs. "Come on," he muttered, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. "Breathe, damn it." After several agonizing moments, Lillian convulsed, water streaming from her mouth as she coughed violently. Yates turned her onto her side, relief flooding through him as color slowly returned to her face. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of polished amber. "My sister," she whispered hoarsely. "She's safe," Yates assured her, glancing toward the tree where Sophia was now carefully making her way down to solid ground. "You both are." Lillian's trembling hand grasped his arm with surprising strength. "Thank you," she managed before another coughing fit overtook her. It took considerable effort to help Sophia safely to shore, and then to get both women onto Yates' patient horse. The sturdy gelding, accustomed to bearing heavier loads than two waterlogged women, carried them steadily as Yates led them on foot toward his ranch, which was closer than the Hayes homestead. "I'm Yates Sutherland," he told them as they traveled. "Got a small spread about a quarter-mile from here." "Lillian Hayes," Lillian responded weakly, her arm protectively around Sophia. "This is my sister, Sophia. Our father's homestead is east of Terlingua Creek." Yates nodded. "Hayes, Thomas Hayes girls." When Lillian nodded, he continued, "Known your father by reputation. Honest man." What he didn't mention was that everyone in the county knew Thomas Hayes had died 6 months ago, leaving his 2 daughters to manage the struggling homestead alone, something nearly impossible in this harsh territory. The Sutherland Ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, a modest but well-maintained single-story structure with a barn and corral beside it. Smoke curled from the chimney, and an older Mexican woman emerged from the front door as they approached. "Dios mío, what happened?" she called, hurrying toward them. "River took them, Carmen," Yates explained as he helped Lillian, then Sophia down from the horse. "Need to get them warm and dry." Carmen Diaz had been Yates' housekeeper since he'd established his ranch 3 years earlier. She quickly took charge, ushering the shivering women inside while Yates tended to his horse. By the time he entered the house, Carmen had settled the sisters near the fireplace with blankets and was preparing hot coffee. "They need dry clothes," Carmen told him. "I have some that might fit the younger one, but the taller one." "Check my trunk," Yates said. "There might be a shirt and trousers that would do until their things dry." While Carmen helped the sisters change in the small bedroom, Yates added wood to the fire and poured himself a measure of whiskey to ward off the chill that had settled in his bones. The near tragedy had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He'd seen death too often in his 30 years during the war between the states, in mining accidents, and in the lawless frontier towns he drifted through before settling in Terlingua. But something about the sight of Lillian Hayes disappearing beneath the muddy waters had struck a particular fear in him. When the women returned to the main room, Sophia was wrapped in one of Carmen's simple dresses, while Lillian wore a pair of Yates trousers rolled up at the ankles and one of his cotton shirts, belted at the waist. Her long chestnut hair, freed from its pins, hung in damp waves past her shoulders. Despite the mismatched attire, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that Yates couldn't help but admire. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Sutherland," Lillian said formally as Carmen handed her a steaming mug of coffee. We wouldn't dream of imposing, but no imposition, Yates interrupted, his deep voice gentle. And it's just Yates. Mr. Sutherland was my father, and he's been gone these 8 years. Sophia, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since their rescue, finally spoke up. You saved our lives, sir, if you hadn't come along when you did. Let's not dwell on what might have been, Carmen interjected, patting Sophia's shoulder. You are safe now, and that is what matters. As the afternoon progressed into evening, the sisters' sodden clothing proved impossible to dry quickly enough for a return journey to their homestead. With darkness falling and both women still weak from their ordeal, Yates insisted they stay the night. Carmen has the small room off the kitchen and I can bed down in the barn, he offered. You two can take my room. Lillian began to protest, but Yates raised a hand. It's settled. The barn's plenty comfortable. I've slept in worse places. That night, as Lillian lay beside her sleeping sister in Yates Sutherland's surprisingly comfortable bed, she found herself unable to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the river pulling her under, stealing the breath from her lungs. And when she did manage to drift off, it was Yates' face. She saw the intensity in his steel-blue eyes as he dragged her from the water, the gentle concern as he watched her breathe again. Out in the barn, Yates was similarly awake, staring at the rough-hewn rafters. He'd encountered plenty of pretty women during his years wandering the West, but something about Lillian Hayes had affected him differently. Perhaps it was the courage she'd shown in trying to save her sister, or the quiet strength she'd demonstrated afterward. Or maybe it was the flash of vulnerability he'd glimpsed beneath her composed exterior, a vulnerability he understood all too well. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of a warming day. Carmen prepared a substantial breakfast of eggs, cornbread, and bacon, which Sophia ate with enthusiasm while Lillian picked at her food, still subdued from the previous day's events. Your clothes are dry, Carmen announced, placing the neatly folded garments on the table. Though I fear they may need mending, the river was not kind to the fabric. Lillian examined her dress, noting the tears along the hem and a missing button. You've been too generous already, she told Carmen. I couldn't ask you to mend our clothing as well. Nonsense, the older woman replied with a dismissive wave. It will give these old hands something useful to do while you regain your strength. Yates, who had been unusually quiet during breakfast, finally spoke up. I need to ride over to your place, he told the sisters. Check on your livestock, make sure everything's secure, Lillian straightened. That's very kind but unnecessary. We can return home today. You're both still recovering, Yates countered, his tone brooking no argument. Besides, I need to mend some fence line near your property anyway. Been meaning to do it for weeks. It was a blatant lie, and from the look Lillian gave him, she knew it. But she didn't challenge him, instead nodding her agreement. We'd be grateful then. The chickens need feeding, and our milk cow, Buttercup, will be uncomfortable if she's not milked. Sophia, who had been watching the exchange with interest, added, And could you check on Daisy? She's my mare, a beautiful Palomino. She gets nervous during storms. I'll see to all of them, Yates promised, rising from the table. He paused, seeming to hesitate before adding, Your father built a good place. Shame about his passing. A shadow crossed Lillian's face. Thank you. We're doing our best to honor his legacy. After Yates departed, Carmen put the sisters to work helping with household chores, simple tasks that wouldn't overtax them, but would keep their minds occupied. As Lillian helped clean the kitchen, she found herself glancing repeatedly at the window, watching for Yates' return. He is a good man, Carmen commented, noticing Lillian's distraction. Stubborn as a mule sometimes, but his heart is true. Lillian felt a flush rise to her cheeks. I'm sure he is. We're fortunate he happened along when he did. Carmen gave her a knowing smile. Some might call that fortune. Others might call it providence. The Hayes homestead was just as Lillian had described, a modest but well-built cabin with a small barn, chicken coop, and vegetable garden. As Yates approached, he noted signs of diligent care, but also the inevitable deterioration that came from having too few hands for too much work. The fence surrounding the property needed repairs. The barn roof had a section of missing shingles, and the garden, while tended, was smaller than would be needed to sustain 2 people through winter. Inside the cabin, evidence of the sisters' struggle to maintain their father's home was even more apparent. Everything was meticulously clean, but the furnishings were sparse, and the larder, which Yates checked out of concern for their welfare, held barely enough supplies to last another month. After tending to the animals as promised, Yates found himself lingering, making small repairs that he knew the women would struggle with, fixing a loose board on the porch, securing the chicken coop's door that hung crookedly on its hinges, and patching the worst of the roof leaks. As he worked, he thought of Lillian's proud demeanor despite her circumstances, and of Sophia's youth and vulnerability in this harsh land. When he finally returned to his ranch in the late afternoon, he found Sophia sitting on the porch swing while Carmen hung laundry nearby. Lillian was nowhere to be seen. "She's resting," Sophia explained before Yates could ask. "The coughing was worse today." Concern furrowed Yates' brow. "Has Carmen given her anything for it?" Sophia nodded. "A tea with honey and some herb I couldn't pronounce. It seemed to help." Yates dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough. "Your place is secure," he told her. "Animals are fed and tended. Daisy seemed particularly pleased with the extra oats I gave her." Sophia's face lit up. "She's terribly spoiled. Father always said she had me wrapped around her hoof instead of the other way around." Her smile faltered slightly at the mention of her father. "He built you a good home," Yates said gently. "He did," Sophia agreed, her voice soft. "But it's harder than we expected, keeping it going without him. Lillian won't admit it, but we're struggling. She works from dawn until dusk, and still it's not enough." Before Yates could respond, the door opened and Lillian emerged, her face pale but composed. She changed back into her own clothing, now neatly mended by Carmen's skilled hands. "You're back," she said, her eyes meeting Yates'. "How was our homestead?" "Standing strong," Yates replied, deliberately keeping his tone light. "Made a few small repairs while I was there. Hope you don't mind." Gratitude and something like embarrassment flashed across Lillian's features. "You've done more than enough for us already, Mr. Yates. We can't possibly repay your kindness." "Not looking for repayment," he said simply. "Neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we survive." That evening, as they shared another meal at Yates' table, the conversation flowed more easily. Sophia, recovering her natural exuberance, entertained them with stories of their journey from Missouri 2 years earlier, when their father had decided to try his luck in the Texas borderlands after their mother's death. "He promised us adventure," Sophia recalled, her eyes bright with the memory. "And he certainly delivered that, though perhaps not in the way he intended." "Sophia," Lillian chided gently, but there was no real reproach in her tone. "It's true," Sophia insisted. "Remember when that skunk got into our wagon outside of Dallas? Father tried to chase it out with a broom, and it sprayed all our Sunday clothes." She dissolved into laughter, and even Lillian couldn't suppress a smile at the recollection. Yates found himself enchanted by the glimpse into their past, and particularly by the softening of Lillian's normally guarded expression as she recalled happier times. After dinner, when Carmen retired and Sophia dozed off in an armchair by the fire, Yates and Lillian found themselves alone on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. "I checked your supplies while I was at your place," Yates admitted after a comfortable silence. "You're running low." Lillian stiffened slightly beside him. "We're managing." "Didn't say you weren't," Yates replied evenly. "But winter comes hard in these parts, even this far south. A single bad crop or sick animal can mean the difference between comfort and starvation." "I'm well aware of the challenges," Lillian said, her voice tight. "We may not have been born to this life, but we've learned its lessons quickly enough." Yates turned to face her. In the silvery moonlight, her features were softened, the strain of recent months less evident. "I'm not questioning your capabilities, Lillian. I've seen how well you've maintained your father's place against impossible odds, but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely." Lillian's gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon. "Is it? Offered freely, I mean." "In my experience, help always comes with expectations attached." The bitterness in her tone surprised him. "Not from me," he said quietly. "I'm offering as one neighbor to another, nothing more." Finally, she looked at him, her amber eyes searching his face as if trying to uncover some hidden motive. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Then I thank you, neighbor," she said, a hint of warmth creeping into her voice. "And I accept on one condition." "Name it." "That you allow us to repay you in kind when we're able. I won't accept charity, but I will accept a fair exchange." Yates nodded slowly. "Deal." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Lillian placed her smaller one in his. The simple contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, and from the slight widening of her eyes, she'd felt it too. The following morning, Yates drove the sisters home in his wagon, having insisted they take supplies from his own storehouse: flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, and other necessities. He'd also loaded their mended clothing, now clean and neatly folded thanks to Carmen's attentions. As they approached the Hayes homestead, Lillian couldn't help but notice the improvements Yates had made during his visit the previous day. The porch steps, which had been loose for months, were now solid. The chicken coop door hung straight on new hinges, and even the garden fence had been reinforced. "You did all this?" she asked, gesturing to the repairs. Yates shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Just small fixes, nothing major." Sophia, who had been unusually thoughtful during the journey, suddenly announced, "You should stay for dinner, Yates. It's the least we can do." "Sophia," Lillian began, "Mr. Sutherland has already spent enough time away from his own responsibilities." "It's just Yates," he reminded her with a smile. "And dinner would be welcome if it's not too much trouble." And so he stayed, helping them unload the supplies and carry water from the well. As Lillian prepared a simple but hearty stew using some of the provisions he'd brought, Yates sat with Sophia on the porch, patiently showing her how to mend harness leather, a skill she'd been struggling to master since their father's death. The domesticity of the scene struck Lillian as she watched them through the open door. For so many months, it had been just her and Sophia against the world, fighting daily battles against nature, scarcity, and occasional human predators who thought two women alone would be easy targets. Having Yates' solid presence, even temporarily, eased a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Over the simple meal, Yates told them about his own journey to Terlingua, how he'd fought for the Confederacy as a young man, then drifted westward after the war, working as a ranch hand and occasionally as a scout for the Army, before winning his current property in a poker game 3 years ago. Previous owner was determined to strike it rich in the silver mines up in Colorado, Yates explained. "Bet his deed against my royal flush. Sometimes I think he got the better end of that deal." "You really believe that?" Lillian asked, genuinely curious. Yates considered the question seriously. Some days when the well runs low, or the cattle break through the fence line for the third time in a week. Yeah, I wonder. But then there are evenings like this, with good food and better company, and I reckon I made out all right. The warmth in his gaze as he spoke caused Lillian's cheeks to flush, and she busied herself clearing the table to hide her reaction. Sophia, not missing the exchange, offered to wash the dishes, practically shooing Lillian and Yates outside to enjoy the sunset. They walked in comfortable silence to the edge of the property, where the land sloped gently toward the distant creek that had given the Hayes homestead its water and nearly claimed the sisters' lives. "It's strange," Lillian said softly, looking toward the winding ribbon of water, now peaceful in the golden evening light. "I've always loved that creek. Now I'm not sure I'll ever look at it the same way." "Water's like fire," Yates replied. "Necessary for life, but dangerous when not respected. The Rio Grande's been claiming lives since before either of us was born, and it'll keep doing so long after we're gone." "A cheerful thought," Lillian remarked wryly. Yates chuckled, the sound rich and warm in the gathering twilight. "Sorry, not much good at philosophical musings." "I disagree," Lillian said, surprising herself with her forthrightness. "You seem to understand the nature of things quite well." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Some things. Others remain a mystery." Before Lillian could respond, a shout from the house drew their attention. Sophia was waving from the porch, pointing excitedly at something in the distance. As they hurried back, they saw the cause of her excitement, a wagon approaching, driven by an elderly man with a younger woman beside him. "It's Dr. Miller and his daughter Martha," Sophia exclaimed. "They must have heard about our accident." Indeed, the local doctor had received word of the incident from a traveler who had witnessed Yates' rescue from a distance. His daughter Martha, who assisted in his practice, had insisted they check on the Hayes sisters immediately. "Word travels fast," Dr. Miller commented as he examined Lillian's chest, listening to her breathing with his stethoscope. "Though in this case, I'm glad it did. There's a touch of congestion in your lungs, Miss Hayes. Not pneumonia yet, but it could develop if not treated." He provided a bottle of medicine and strict instructions for rest, then turned his attention to Sophia, pronouncing her remarkably well recovered from her ordeal. As the doctor packed his bag, Martha Miller took Lillian aside. "We've been so worried about you too," Martha confessed. "The whole town has, ever since your father—" She hesitated, then continued, "Well, many of us have wanted to help, but you've been so independent." Lillian felt a twinge of shame at the gentle rebuke. "It's been difficult to accept assistance," she admitted. "Father always taught us to stand on our own." Martha nodded understandingly. "Independence is admirable, but community is essential, especially out here." She glanced toward Yates, who was speaking with the doctor near the wagon. "Mr. Sutherland seems to have broken through that barrier, at least." Lillian followed her gaze. "He saved our lives. It would be ungracious to refuse his help after that." "Is that the only reason you've accepted his assistance?" Martha asked, a knowing smile playing at her lips. Before Lillian could formulate a response, Yates approached them. "Doctor says he'll return in a few days to check on you both," he informed Lillian. "And he's invited me to escort you to the town social next Saturday, if you're feeling up to it by then." "Social?" Lillian repeated, confused. "I didn't know there was one planned." "First Saturday of every month," Martha explained. "It's not elaborate, just a community gathering at the schoolhouse with food and sometimes dancing. But it would do you both good to reconnect with neighbors." After the Millers departed, Yates prepared to leave as well, despite Sophia's protests that it was growing too dark for safe travel. "My horse knows the way," he assured her, "and I've got a lantern if needed." As he hitched his horse to the wagon, Lillian approached him, her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Yates paused in his work, turning to face her. In the fading light, her features were soft, her usual guardedness momentarily absent. "You're welcome," he replied. "Though as I recall, we agreed this was a neighborly exchange, not a debt to be repaid." "Even so," Lillian insisted. "You've done more than most would." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to maintain eye contact. "Maybe I had my own reasons," he said, his voice lower than before. "Such as?" Lillian asked, her heart suddenly racing. For a moment, Yates looked as if he might say something significant, but then he glanced toward the house, where Sophia was watching from the window, and stepped back. "Just being a good neighbor," he said lightly. "I'll check on you both tomorrow if that's all right." Lillian nodded, ignoring the pang of disappointment his withdrawal had caused. "We'd like that." Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Yates would arrive at the Hayes homestead each morning, help with the heavier chores, then return to his own ranch by midday to tend his cattle and handle his own work. Some evenings he would return for dinner, bringing small gifts: a rabbit he'd caught, fresh vegetables from Carmen's garden, once even a book of poetry he'd found in town and thought Sophia might enjoy. During this time, Lillian observed him closely, trying to understand the complex man who had saved them from the river. He was unfailingly kind, surprisingly well-read for a rancher, and possessed a dry wit that often caught her off guard. But there was a sadness beneath his calm exterior, a shadow that occasionally darkened his eyes when he thought no one was looking for his part. Yates found himself increasingly drawn to the Hayes sisters' home, particularly to Lillian's quiet strength and hidden depths. While Sophia was an open book, cheerful and forthright in her thoughts and feelings, Lillian revealed herself in subtle ways through the care she took with their modest home, her fierce protectiveness toward her sister, and the rare but dazzling smile that transformed her serious face when something genuinely amused her. As the Saturday of the town social approached, both Lillian and Yates found themselves experiencing an unfamiliar nervousness. Lillian spent hours deciding which of her 2 good dresses to wear, while Yates, to Carmen's amusement, actually asked for help shaving properly and selecting a clean shirt. "You look like a man going courting," Carmen teased as she ironed his best shirt the morning of the social. Yates frowned, uncomfortable with her assessment. "Just being neighborly," he muttered, the phrase becoming something of a mantra lately. Carmen snorted disbelievingly. "If you say so, patron, but I have eyes in my head. The way you look at that girl is not neighborly." When Yates arrived at the Hayes homestead that afternoon, he was struck speechless by the transformation in both sisters. Sophia was lovely in a pale blue dress that matched her eyes, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style clearly meant to impress. But it was Lillian who captured his full attention. She wore a simple but elegant green dress that brought out the gold flecks in her amber eyes, and her chestnut hair was partially up, with soft curls framing her face. "You look," Yates began, then faltered, unable to find words adequate to the vision before him. "Presentable," Lillian suggested with a small smile, misinterpreting his hesitation as disappointment. "Beautiful," Yates corrected firmly. "Both of you," he added quickly, including Sophia in his compliment. The schoolhouse in Terlingua had been transformed for the social, with lanterns hanging from the rafters and tables laden with food prepared by the women of the community. As Yates helped the sisters down from his wagon, they were immediately surrounded by townspeople, many expressing relief at seeing them recovered from their ordeal and offering belated condolences on their father's passing. Martha Miller quickly pulled Sophia into a group of young people her age, while Lillian found herself engaged in conversation with several of the town's matrons, who tactfully but persistently inquired about her plans for the homestead, now that she was alone with a young sister to care for. "We're managing quite well," Lillian assured Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, though her smile felt strained. "The property is productive, and Sophia and I are more capable than we appear." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Peterson replied, patting her arm, "but two young women alone. It's not just the work, you understand. It's the propriety of the situation. Your father would have wanted you properly settled." Lillian bit back a sharp retort, aware that the older woman meant well. "Father wanted us to be independent," she said instead. "He taught us to value our freedom." "Independence is all well and good," interjected Mrs. Davis, the general store owner's wife, "but a woman needs protection in these parts. Just look at what nearly happened at the river, if Mr. Sutherland hadn't come along." She shuddered dramatically. Across the room, Yates was experiencing a similar interrogation from the men of Terlingua. "Fine piece of land, the Hayes place," commented Sheriff Wilson as he sipped punch beside Yates. "Shame Thomas didn't have a son to leave it to. Those girls can't possibly maintain it properly." "They're doing better than most would in their situation," Yates defended, his tone sharper than intended. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "No need to bristle, Sutherland. Just stating facts. Girl like Lillian Hayes should be married with a family of her own, not trying to work a homestead. And that pretty little sister of hers is going to attract trouble if she stays out there much longer." Yates' jaw tightened. "They're managing." "With your help, from what I hear," the sheriff replied knowingly. "Town's been talking. You've been spending an awful lot of time over at the Hayes place these past weeks." Before Yates could respond, the small band that had assembled at the front of the room struck up a lively tune, and couples began to form for dancing. Seeing an escape from the uncomfortable conversation, Yates excused himself and made his way to where Lillian stood, still surrounded by well-meaning but invasive townswomen. "May I have this dance, Miss Hayes?" he asked formally, extending his hand. Relief flooded Lillian's features as she placed her hand in his. "You may, Mr. Sutherland, if you'll excuse me, ladies." As he led her to the dance floor, Lillian murmured, "Thank you for the rescue. Again." Yates smiled, his hand settling at her waist as they took their positions for the country dance. "Seemed like you needed saving from those vultures, though I just escaped a similar inquisition from the men. Let me guess, they're concerned about two helpless women living alone on a valuable piece of property," Lillian said dryly as they moved through the steps of the dance. "Something like that," Yates confirmed, guiding her through a turn. "Though they seemed more concerned about your marital status than your safety." Lillian's laugh was genuine. "Mrs. Peterson was just suggesting that the new preacher's assistant might make a suitable husband for me. Apparently, he's very steady and good with figures." "High praise indeed," Yates remarked, fighting an unexpected surge of jealousy at the thought. They danced in comfortable silence for a few moments, each enjoying the simple pleasure of movement and music after weeks of hardship and worry. Yates was a surprisingly good dancer, Lillian discovered, moving with a natural grace that belied his usual taciturn demeanor. "You dance well for a rancher," she observed as he guided her through a particularly complicated turn without missing a step. "My mother's influence," he explained. "She was determined her son would be a gentleman, despite my father's protests that dancing wouldn't help me run cattle." "And was she right?" Lillian asked, curious about this glimpse into his past. Yates considered the question. "She was right that there's more to life than practical skills. Though I'm not sure how gentlemanly I turned out in the end. Gentlemanly enough to rescue drowning women and dance with them afterward," Lillian replied with a small smile. The music shifted to a slower waltz, and other couples moved onto the floor. Yates hesitated, unsure if Lillian would want to continue dancing, but she moved naturally into the proper position, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as his settled more firmly at her waist. "People are watching us," Lillian murmured as they began to move to the gentle rhythm. "Let them," Yates replied, his voice low and intimate in a way that sent a shiver through her. "Unless you'd prefer to stop." "No," she admitted, meeting his gaze directly. "I wouldn't." As they swayed together, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. Lillian was acutely aware of Yates' strength, of the careful way he held her close enough for propriety, but with a respectfulness that touched her deeply. For his part, Yates found himself captivated by the woman in his arms, by her quiet dignity and the vulnerability she allowed him, and few others, to glimpse. The spell was broken when Sophia rushed up to them as the music ended, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Lillian, Mr. Fletcher has invited us to join his family for a picnic after church tomorrow. Can we go? Please?" Lillian glanced at Yates, noting the slight tightening around his eyes at Sophia's interruption. "That would be lovely, Sophia. Though we'd need to check with Mr. Sutherland about using his wagon again." "You're welcome to it," Yates said immediately, though his enthusiasm seemed somewhat diminished. "In fact, I should probably see about getting you both home. It's growing late." The ride back to the Hayes homestead was quieter than the journey into town had been. Sophia chattered excitedly about the young people she'd met and the invitations they'd received, while Lillian and Yates exchanged occasional glances but said little. There was a tension between them now, an awareness that had been crystallized by their dance but remained unspoken. When they arrived, Yates helped both sisters down from the wagon, his hand lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary in Lillian's. "I've got to head to San Antonio for supplies next week," he told them as Sophia unlocked the front door. "Probably be gone 3 or 4 days." "Oh," Lillian said, surprised by how disappointed the news made her feel. "Well, safe travels then. Could I speak with you privately before I go?" Yates asked, nodding toward the porch swing while Sophia disappeared inside. Once they were seated, a respectable distance apart on the swing, Yates seemed to struggle for words. "I wanted to. That is, I've been meaning to ask." He stopped, clearly frustrated with himself, then tried again. "The thing is, Lillian, I've grown very fond of you and Sophia these past weeks." Lillian's heart began to race, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "We've appreciated your help tremendously." "It's more than that," Yates pressed on, "at least for me. I find myself thinking about you when we're apart, wondering how you're faring, if you're safe, if you're—" He paused, then finished simply, "happy." "Yates," Lillian began, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected confession. "You don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I'm not asking for any declarations. I just wanted you to know that my interest in your welfare goes beyond neighborly concern. And when I return from San Antonio, I'd like to call on you properly, if you're amenable." Lillian studied his face in the moonlight, seeing the sincerity and the carefully banked hope in his eyes. "I'd like that," she said softly. The smile that spread across Yates' face was transformative, erasing years of hardship and solitude. "Really?" "Really," Lillian confirmed, allowing herself a small smile in return. "Though I should warn you, I'm not the easiest woman to court. I'm stubborn, too independent for most men's tastes, and I come with a sister who requires proper chaperoning." Yates chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I'm well aware of all those facts, Miss Hayes. They're part of what I admire about you." As he rose to leave, he hesitated, then leaned down and placed a chaste kiss on her cheek, a gesture so gentle and unexpected that Lillian found herself momentarily speechless. "Until I return," he said softly, then stepped off the porch and mounted his wagon. Lillian remained on the swing long after his wagon had disappeared into the night, her fingers lightly touching the spot where his lips had brushed her skin. The following days passed both too quickly and too slowly for Lillian. She found herself thinking of Yates, constantly recalling their dance at the social, the warmth in his eyes when he'd asked to court her, the gentle pressure of his lips on her cheek. These thoughts both thrilled and terrified her. Since their father's death, she'd been focused solely on survival and on protecting Sophia. The idea of allowing herself to care deeply for someone else, to potentially build a future that included a man like Yates Sutherland, was simultaneously appealing and frightening. Sophia, of course, noticed the change in her sister immediately. "You're falling in love with him," she declared on the third day of Yates' absence as they worked together in the garden. "Don't be ridiculous," Lillian protested, though the blush that spread across her cheeks betrayed her. "I barely know him." "You know he's brave, kind, hardworking, and looks at you like you're the sunrise after the longest night," Sophia countered, ticking off these qualities on her dirt-covered fingers. "Plus, he's rather handsome, if a bit weather-beaten." Lillian couldn't help but laugh at her sister's assessment. "You've been reading too many dime novels." "Perhaps," Sophia admitted cheerfully, "but I'm not wrong about this, and for what it's worth I approve heartily. Yates would make an excellent brother-in-law." "Sophia," Lillian exclaimed, scandalized, "he's asked to court me, not marry me." "Yet," Sophia added with a knowing smile. The day Yates was expected to return, Lillian found herself unusually attentive to her appearance, washing her hair with the special lavender soap she normally saved for special occasions and selecting her nicest everyday dress. Sophia observed these preparations with barely concealed amusement, but wisely kept her comments to herself. As morning stretched into afternoon with no sign of Yates, Lillian tried to quell her disappointment. "The journey from San Antonio can be unpredictable," she reminded herself aloud as she kneaded bread dough with perhaps more vigor than necessary. "Roads wash out, wheels break, any number of delays could occur." "Of course," Sophia agreed soothingly, "he'll be here when he can." But by evening, with still no word from Yates, Lillian couldn't help feeling a creeping anxiety. Had she misinterpreted his intentions? Had something happened on the road? Or had he simply changed his mind about courting a woman with so many complications in her life? It was near midnight, with both sisters already in bed, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats roused them. Lillian rushed to the window, relief flooding through her at the sight of Yates' familiar silhouette in the moonlight. But something was wrong. He was slumped in the saddle, and his horse was moving at an unusual pace. "Sophia, stay inside," Lillian commanded, grabbing her shawl and hurrying out the door. As she approached, she could see that Yates was barely conscious, clinging to the saddle horn with what appeared to be the last of his strength. His shirt was dark with what could only be blood. "Yates!" she cried, reaching his horse just as he began to slide from the saddle. Somehow she managed to break his fall, though his weight nearly took them both to the ground. "What happened? Who did this to you?" "Bandits," he gasped, his face pale with blood loss. "Near the crossing. Took everything. Shot me when I fought back." Sophia had ignored her sister's command to stay inside and now helped Lillian half carry, half drag Yates into the house. Together, they managed to get him onto Lillian's bed, where she quickly cut away his blood-soaked shirt to reveal a bullet wound in his left shoulder. "Sophia, get water boiling and bring my sewing kit," Lillian instructed, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "And Father's whiskey from the top shelf." As Sophia rushed to comply, Lillian carefully examined the wound. The bullet had passed through Yates' shoulder, which was both good and bad news. No need to extract it, but 2 wounds to treat instead of 1. It had missed major arteries, judging by the fact that he was still alive, but the bleeding was still concerning. "You're going to be fine," she assured him, though she wasn't entirely certain of this herself. The bullet went clean through. Yates managed a weak smile. "Sorry, not exactly how I planned our reunion." "Hush," Lillian scolded gently, pressing a clean cloth to the wound. "Save your strength." When Sophia returned with the requested items, Lillian set to work cleaning and disinfecting the wounds as best she could with the limited supplies available. Yates gritted his teeth against the pain as she poured whiskey over both entry and exit wounds, but a low groan escaped him despite his efforts. "I need to stitch these closed," Lillian told him, threading a needle with steady hands. "It's going to hurt." "Not my first bullet," Yates murmured, his eyes fixed on her face. "Go ahead." Lillian worked methodically, her stitches small and even thanks to years of mending clothing. Sophia assisted by keeping the wounds clean as Lillian worked, and by holding Yates' hand when the pain became too intense. By the time Lillian tied off the last stitch, Yates had passed out from the combination of pain, blood loss, and exhaustion. "Will he be all right?" Sophia asked anxiously as they bandaged the wounds. Lillian smoothed a damp lock of hair from Yates' forehead. "I think so, if infection doesn't set in, but we should send for Dr. Miller at first light." "I'll go," Sophia volunteered immediately. "I can ride Daisy into town faster than the wagon would take." Lillian nodded her agreement, too tired to argue about the propriety of Sophia riding alone. "Take Father's pistol, just in case. And be careful." As dawn broke, Sophia set off for town while Lillian maintained her vigil at Yates' bedside. His fever had risen during the night, his body fighting the trauma and potential infection. Lillian bathed his face and chest with cool water, murmuring reassurances when he stirred restlessly. During one moment of lucidity, Yates caught her hand as she adjusted his bandages. "You should have seen the other fellows," he joked weakly. "I'm sure they regret crossing Yates Sutherland," Lillian replied, relieved to see a flash of his usual spirit was coming. "To see you," he continued, his voice fading. "Couldn't wait. Another day." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. "Well, you've certainly ensured a lengthy visit now. You're not going anywhere until that shoulder heals." A ghost of a smile touched his lips before he drifted back into unconsciousness, his hand still holding hers. Dr. Miller arrived by mid-morning with Sophia and Sheriff Wilson in tow. After examining the wounds, the doctor praised Lillian's handiwork. "Couldn't have done much better myself," he admitted, adding a salve of his own to fight infection. "Though he'll need time and rest to heal completely." The sheriff took a statement from Yates, who was more alert after the doctor's ministrations. "Sounds like the Barton gang," Wilson concluded grimly. "They've been hitting travelers near the river crossing for months. I'll send telegrams to neighboring counties, see if we can track them down." "They took everything," Yates told Lillian after the sheriff departed. "The supplies I'd bought in San Antonio, my month's profits from cattle sales, even my father's watch." "None of that matters," Lillian assured him, squeezing his hand. "What matters is that you're alive." Over the next 2 weeks, Yates recovered slowly under Lillian's attentive care. Unable to return to his ranch, he became a semi-permanent resident of the Hayes homestead, sleeping in Thomas Hayes' old room once he was strong enough to leave Lillian's bed. Carmen came daily from Yates' ranch to help with chores, and to bring news of how his property was faring in his absence. This forced proximity accelerated the courtship that had barely begun before Yates' injury. Long conversations by lamplight revealed their shared values and complementary temperaments. Yates learned of Lillian's childhood in Missouri, where her mother had insisted on education for both daughters despite neighbors' disapproval. Lillian discovered Yates' dreams for his ranch not an empire, but a sustainable, well-run operation that might someday support a family. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Yates broached a subject that had been on his mind. "Your neighbors in town," he began hesitantly, "they weren't entirely wrong about the challenges you face here." Lillian stiffened. "We're managing." "You are," Yates agreed quickly. "Better than anyone could expect, but it's a hard life, Lillian, especially with winter coming." "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Yates shifted to face her more directly. "I'm suggesting that perhaps there's a way to make things easier for both of us. My ranch needs more attention than I can give it alone. Your homestead is the same. Together." He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "Together," Lillian prompted, her heart racing. "I know it's too soon," Yates continued, his words coming faster now. "We've only known each other a short while, but I can't deny what I feel for you, Lillian. These past weeks, injured as I've been, have been the happiest of my life because I've spent them with you." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "Yates, let me finish," he requested gently. "I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. That would be presumptuous, but I am proposing a partnership. Combine our efforts, our resources. You and Sophia could move to my ranch. It's larger, better built for winter. We could work both properties together." "And what would people say?" Lillian asked, though her tone lacked its usual defensiveness. "They'll talk regardless," Yates pointed out with a wry smile. "But if propriety is a concern, Carmen would serve as chaperone. She's been after me to find a wife for years. She'd be thrilled to oversee a proper courtship." Lillian was silent for a long moment, considering his proposal. Finally, she said, "It makes practical sense. But I need to know, is that all it is to you?" "A practical arrangement." Yates took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "You know it's not. I care for you, Lillian, deeply. More than I thought possible after so many years alone. But I respect you too much to rush this. I want to do things properly, give you time to be sure of your own feelings." The sincerity in his eyes touched Lillian profoundly. This man, who had saved her life, who had shown nothing but respect and kindness since that fateful day at the river, was offering her not just practical help but a chance at happiness on her own terms and timeline. "I'll need to discuss it with Sophia," she said finally. Yates nodded, understanding the responsibility she felt toward her sister. Of course. But Sophia, when consulted, was enthusiastically in favor of the plan. "It's perfect," she exclaimed. "We'll be safer, warmer this winter, and you and Yates can court properly. Plus, his ranch is closer to town, which means more socials for me." Lillian laughed at her sister's transparent self-interest. "Is that all you think about? Socials and young men?" "Not all," Sophia replied, suddenly serious. "I think about your happiness too, Lillian. You've sacrificed so much for me since Father died. You deserve some joy of your own." Touched by her sister's insight, Lillian hugged her tightly. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise," Sophia declared with mock indignation. "You've just been too busy being responsible to notice." The move to Yates' ranch was accomplished with surprising ease. The Hayes sisters didn't own many possessions, and what they valued most, their mother's china, their father's books, family portraits, and Sophia's beloved collection of ribbons fit easily into Yates' wagon. The livestock were a bit more challenging, but with help from some of Yates' neighboring ranchers. Even Buttercup, the cow, and Sophia's temperamental mare made the journey safely. Carmen welcomed them with open arms, and a feast that had Sophia declaring she'd never eat so well at their old homestead. The housekeeper had prepared the ranch's second bedroom for the sisters, moving Yates back to his own room now that his injury was healing well. "This is only temporary," Carmen assured Lillian with a meaningful glance between her and Yates. "Soon, perhaps different arrangements will be appropriate." Lillian blushed furiously at the implication, while Yates coughed awkwardly and changed the subject. Life at the Sutherland Ranch quickly fell into a pleasant rhythm. Yates and Lillian worked side by side during the days, their complementary skills making both properties more productive than either had been separately. Sophia divided her time between helping with household chores, tending the expanded kitchen garden, and increasingly frequent visits to town with Carmen as chaperone. The courtship between Yates and Lillian progressed naturally within this shared life. Evening walks became a cherished ritual, their conversations ranging from practical ranch matters to deeper discussions of hopes and fears. Yates proved to be a thoughtful listener and an unexpectedly romantic suitor, once bringing Lillian wildflowers he'd spotted while checking the cattle in a distant pasture. "They reminded me of you," he said simply, as he presented the bouquet. Beautiful but strong enough to thrive in harsh conditions. On a crisp October evening, nearly 3 months after the river rescue, Yates suggested a ride to a special spot on his property. "There's something I want to show you," he told Lillian mysteriously. They rode side by side, their horses matching pace naturally, until they reached a rise overlooking both the Sutherland Ranch and, in the distance, the Hayes homestead. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, taking in the vista. "I come here to think," Yates explained, dismounting and helping her down from her horse, "when decisions need making or troubles need sorting." They stood together at the edge of the rise, and Yates took both her hands in his. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he said, his voice unusually solemn. Lillian looked up at him, noting the nervous tension in his normally confident demeanor. About how quickly life can change," he replied. 3 months ago I was alone, convinced that solitude was my fate. Then a flooded river and 2 drowning women changed everything." He paused, his thumbs tracing circles on the backs of her hands. "I don't want to wait any longer, Lillian. These months with you have shown me what my life could be, what it should be." Understanding dawned on Lillian as Yates dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "Lillian Hayes, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? I promise to cherish you, respect your independence, protect you when needed, and stand beside you always, for as long as we both shall live." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes as emotion overwhelmed her. This man who had saved her life and then, more gradually but just as surely, saved her heart from the loneliness that had threatened to engulf it after her father's death, was offering her a lifetime together. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Yates Sutherland, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy as he rose and pulled her into his embrace. Their first real kiss was tentative at first, then deepened as Lillian responded to the tenderness in Yates' touch. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling. "I should warn you," Lillian said, attempting to regain her composure. "Marriage to me means taking on Sophia as well, at least until she finds a husband of her own." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Yates assured her. "She's part of the package, and I've grown quite fond of her too, though in an entirely brotherly way," he added with a grin. The wedding took place in early December, a small but joyful ceremony in the Terlingua church. Sophia served as maid of honor, beaming with approval as she watched her sister, radiant in a new dress of ivory silk, pledge her life to Yates. Carmen, who had become like family to them all, dabbed at tears throughout the service. Sheriff Wilson stood as Yates' best man, and the citizens of Terlingua turned out in force to witness the union of the rescued woman and her rescuer. Even Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Davis, who had been so concerned about the propriety of the Hayes sisters' situation, gave their wholehearted approval to the match. "Always knew they'd end up together," Mrs. Davis declared to anyone who would listen at the reception. "From the moment he pulled her from that river, it was destiny." The newlyweds spent their wedding night at the hotel in town, a rare luxury in Terlingua, before returning to the ranch, which was now officially their shared home. Sophia had insisted on staying with Carmen to give them privacy for their first week of marriage, a gesture that both embarrassed and touched Lillian. That first night alone in their home, as Yates carried her across the threshold in accordance with tradition, Lillian felt a sense of rightness that had been absent from her life for too long. This was where she belonged, not just in this house or on this land, but with this man who had risked his life to save hers, and then had the patience and wisdom to win her heart through respect and partnership. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sutherland," Yates murmured, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Lillian smiled up at him, her heart full. "It's good to be home, Mr. Sutherland." Their life together settled into a rhythm that suited them both, working side by side during the days, sharing quiet evenings by the fire, and discovering the joys of marriage behind closed doors at night. Sophia returned after their honeymoon week, bringing a liveliness to the household that complemented the deeper contentment Lillian and Yates had found together. Spring came early to Terlingua in 1876, bringing with it renewal and growth. The Hayes homestead, which they had maintained as additional grazing land, flourished under their joint care. Yates' cattle herd increased, and Lillian's garden yielded abundance that Carmen transformed into delicious meals. It was during this season of renewal that Lillian discovered she was expecting their first child. When she shared the news with Yates one evening as they sat on the porch swing, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, tenderness, and a protectiveness that made her feel cherished rather than diminished. "A baby," he repeated in wonder, his hand gently covering hers where it rested on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you pleased?" Lillian asked, though his beaming face made the question almost unnecessary. "Please doesn't begin to describe it," Yates assured her, pulling her closer. "I never thought I'd be blessed with a family of my own. Now I have you, Sophia, and soon this little one." He placed a gentle kiss on her forehead. "I'm the richest man in Texas." As Lillian's pregnancy progressed, Sophia threw herself into preparations for the baby with characteristic enthusiasm, sewing tiny garments and reading every book on childcare she could find. Carmen shared traditional Mexican remedies for morning sickness and promised to teach the child Spanish along with English. "Every advantage," she declared firmly. "In this world, knowing 2 languages is better than 1. In late November, as the first winter chills settled over Terlingua, Lillian gave birth to a son they named Thomas Yates Sutherland, honoring both her father and his. With his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined chin, little Thomas quickly became the center of their world. Sophia adored her nephew, spending hours singing to him and telling him stories about the grandfather he would never meet. "He'll know father through our memories," she assured Lillian one afternoon as they watched the baby sleep. "Just as he'll know mother through yours." Life wasn't always easy. The West remained a challenging place, with droughts, occasional outlaw troubles, and the ordinary hardships of ranching life. But the foundation Lillian and Yates had built first through their river rescue, then through partnership, and finally through marriage proved strong enough to weather any storm. 2 years after Thomas's birth, they welcomed a daughter, Emma Rose, who inherited her father's quiet strength and her mother's quick mind. Sophia, now 23 and being courted by the new schoolteacher, doted on her niece as she had on her nephew, creating a household filled with love and laughter. On the 5th anniversary of the river rescue that had brought them together, Yates took Lillian back to the spot where he had proposed. Standing on the rise overlooking their prosperous ranch, now expanded to include both original properties and additional acreage, they reflected on the journey that had led them to this moment. "You ever think about that day?" Yates asked, his arm around Lillian's waist as they watched the sunset. "How different our lives might be if I hadn't happened to ride by when I did." Lillian leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength that had become her anchor. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens," she admitted. "But I do thank Providence every day for bringing you to that riverbank at exactly the right moment." Yates turned to face her, his expression serious. "It wasn't just chance, Lillian. I believe with all my heart that we were meant to find each other, that some force greater than ourselves guided me to you that day." Lillian had never been one for romantic sentimentality, but as she looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her from drowning and then taught her heart to soar, she found herself agreeing. "Perhaps you're right. After all, what are the odds that a confirmed bachelor would happen upon two drowning sisters and end up with a family he never knew he wanted?" "The best kind of odds," Yates replied with a smile, drawing her into a kiss that still, after 5 years of marriage, made her heart race. "The kind that changed everything for the better." As they rode home in the gathering twilight, Lillian reflected on the twisting path that had brought her to this life, a path that had begun with terror and near tragedy, but had led to the deepest joy she had ever known. The river that had almost claimed her life had instead given her a new one, washing away her lonely independence and carrying her into the arms of a man who valued her strength even as he offered his own. Thomas and Emma were waiting on the porch with Carmen and Sophia when they returned, the children rushing to greet them with excited tales of their day's adventures. As Yates swung his son up onto his shoulders, and Lillian gathered her daughter into her arms, she caught her husband's eye over the children's heads. The look they shared spoke volumes of gratitude for the past, contentment in the present, and hope for the future they would continue to build together. From the raging waters of the Rio Grande had come not death but life, not loss but gain, not ending but beginning. And for that, Lillian would be forever grateful. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Lillian and Yates stood together at the window, looking out at the star-filled Texas sky. "I never thought I could be this happy," Lillian confessed softly. "After Father died, I was so focused on survival that happiness seemed like an impossible luxury." Yates wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "And I never thought I deserved this kind of happiness," he replied. "After the war, the things I'd seen and done, I figured a solitary life was my lot." "We were both wrong," Lillian said, turning in his embrace to face him, "and I've never been so glad to be proven wrong in my life." "Nor I," Yates agreed, brushing a tender kiss across her lips. "Here's to being wrong, and to the river that showed us a better way." Outside their window, under the vast Texas sky, the same Rio Grande that had nearly claimed their lives continued its eternal journey. A reminder that even the most dangerous currents could sometimes carry one precisely where they needed to be.